It will come as no surprise to you, it's not a well-guarded secret that I am not a biblical scholar. But as Michael was kind enough to remind me, we are all theologians, certainly of our own spiritual journeys, right? And that's what I want to share with you today. I want to tell you a little bit about some things I've learned along my unfolding spiritual journey. It's unfolding now, right now before you. This is part of it. And we're going to get to this passage in Mark. But we're going to take a little bit of a secular back route to get there. So bear with me. When Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, was 19 years old, he was studying Latin. Like you do. You all remember those crazy days when you were 19 and studying Latin. And as part of his studies, he was reading the writings and notes of the 15th into 16th century Dutch Catholic theologian and philosopher Erasmus. And he came across the phrase, "Bidden or unbidden, God is present." It's kind of a beautiful, stunning phrase. Carl Jung was so impacted by it that he had it etched in stone in the original Latin outside his house in Switzerland, and apparently he had it, or someone had it, inscribed on his tombstone after he died. I was so impressed by it that I wanted to dig down on its history, because any phrase that's several hundred years old has a backstory, right? And I was not disappointed. Turns out that the original iteration of this phrase is attributed to the oracle at Delphi. When the Spartans were getting ready to attack the Athenians, they went to the oracle for counsel and guidance. And the oracle told them, yes, the gods are with you, but in what form and to what purpose? And I thought, that's the crux of the struggle. God is with me, but in what form? Am I seeing you? Am I feeling you? Am I hearing you, God? And to what purpose? I mean, what purpose am I, this teeny tiny cog in this vast machinery of creation and existence? But still this phrase, bidden or unbidden, God is present, it gave me comfort. All those times that my communication pipeline to God seemed clogged or broken, God was with me. God was in me. It was going to be okay. Now, shortly after I read about Carl Jung finding this phrase in Erasmus's writings, I read the book Man's Search for Meaning. It's a book written by the Austrian neurologist and psychologist Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl's backstory is kind of important because Viktor Frankl was a Jew in Austria in the 1930s and 1940s, so you know where this story is headed, right? 9 months after he was married, he, his wife, his family were all interred in Nazi concentration camps. His father died of starvation and pneumonia at 81 years old. His mother and brother were murdered at Auschwitz. His wife died of typhus in a concentration camp, and over the course of 3 years, Viktor Frankl was interred in 4 concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Dachau. And when he was liberated, he returned to his medical practice, but he began increasingly focusing on the seemingly most human of psychological conundrums. What are we doing here? Why are we doing it? When he wrote Man's Search for Meaning, he reflected in detail on what he found to be the most common characteristics among the people who were able to survive, sometimes against ridiculously impossible odds. And he determined, upon reflection, including his own experience, that it wasn't the strongest, the youngest, the fittest, the most courageous. The common element, the common characteristic that survivors had was that they believed their life had meaning. They believed they had a purpose here. And they had decided, they had dug deep within the wells of themselves, and they had decided that the purpose they were put here for was more important to fulfill than these external circumstances going on around them trying to derail that. Now, I'm greatly oversimplifying this, and if you haven't read the book, I recommend you read it. It's a powerful work. But Viktor Frankl reduces to a bit of a paradigm. He said, look, the only power, we have one single power here in this form, this human form, and that power lies in this very brief period of time between stimulus and response. That point when external stimulus hits you upside the head, not even expecting it, and that moment when you decide how you're going to respond to it. Okay? The only power we have as humans lies in the choices we make. Now, this wasn't the first time I'd heard this philosophy, right? The Stoics had espoused it thousands of years before Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations, Epictetus. Your life's not defined by all these things going on around you that you have no control over. Your life's defined by how you react to these things. But suddenly, at this point in my spiritual journey, this all coalesced for me. And I thought, well, wait a minute. Bidden or unbidden, God is present, so God's here with me, and the only power I have here is in the choices that I make. So what if I'm closest to God when I'm making choices? I mean, what if this is our only power here, what if this thing we call faith, this thing we call spirituality, what if these are interactive processes in which God relies on us to make good choices, just as we rely on God to give us strength and guidance and show us grace in making those choices? What if, to paraphrase a great quote I heard by the actor Bradley Whitford, what if grace isn't something we should be expecting to happen to us from up on high? What if grace is something we should be making happen for us, here and now? And I thought, what if we do that through our choices, right? Remember when Reverend Rajiv would always say, in this realm we're God's feet and hands, God's face. Well, what if in this realm we're God's choices? Kind of powerful. Choice is a big thing, right? But caveat, choice is really hard. If you've ever tried to pick a color of paint for a room, you know what I'm talking about, right? There are about 4,368 shades of white, and some people will tell you white's not even a color. So when you get to the bigger choices, the meatier choices, should I take this job? Should I marry this person? Should I have a child? Regular milk, oat milk, the really, really big choices that we make in life, it can be overwhelming. It can be so overwhelming that if you're like me, you often filter your choices through fear. I once heard someone say that there are only two sources from which we make our choices, love or fear. And I thought, yikes, right? I'm in trouble. And I'm not proud to admit this to you, but it is so often easier to be afraid than it is to love. But then I heard this wonderful quote by Nelson Mandela, who said, "May your choices reflect your hopes and not your fears." And I thought, wow, what a wonderful world that would be. And then I thought, isn't that what Jesus' ministry was all about? Wasn't Jesus' ministry all about the power of choice? You know, I've read a number of books on Jesus the man, Jesus the mortal, Jesus the historical figure. And I got to tell you, Jesus had a perfectly good life, right? He had a good family. He had a trade he could make a living at. He didn't have to stand up to the most powerful, brutal empire at the time. He didn't have to stand up to the authority structure in his own religion and say, you're making bad choices here. This isn't how you bring grace to the world. Jesus ministered to the most marginal people in society. He ministered almost exclusively to the sick, the poor, immigrants, outcasts, women, the same people that we marginalize so often in our societies even today, because humanity has a flat learning curve. But those were all choices. Bold choices, right? History-changing choices. When Jesus ministered to people, he didn't just choose to walk among them and live among the marginalized in society. He chose to look them in the eyes and treat them with the dignity and respect that every living being deserves. Bold choices. And I think that that's what our passage is about today. I think this passage, at least in part, is about the power of choice. You know, in this passage, Jesus and the disciples they're tired. It says they have been running all over the place. They haven't even had time to eat. And that hit me because I do not skip meals. And I thought, wait a second, Jesus, you got to do something here, self-care time. And Jesus recognized it. He said, look, get some food together. We're going to go have a meal. We're going to go to a secluded place. We're going to recharge our batteries. Disciples get everything together. They get in their little rowboat. Off they go. But someone sees them. And he tells two friends, and they tell two friends, and apparently they're all Olympic sprinters, because this passage tells us that they go running on foot, and they get there before Jesus and the disciples. So when Jesus and the disciples row up, here are all these people. And this isn't a little block party of uninvited interlopers, right? This is 5,000 people. That's Burning Man and Coachella and Live Aid all put together. And Jesus and the disciples are hungry, tired, they row up, and I believe there's a part of Jesus the man that's like, God, people ruin everything. What are they doing here, right? And it would be so easy in that moment, justifiably easy, for Jesus to have seen them through fear. I don't have it in me, God. I can't do this now. But in that moment, Jesus makes a choice. He chooses love. He sees the need in these people. And the passage tells us that he starts ministering to them, teaching them. And this goes on for a little while, and the disciples are like, tick, tock, Jesus, this has been great, but we're tired. We are literally in the middle of God knows where. And you need to tell these people, give them their benediction, and send them home, get their supper. And in that moment, it would have been so easy for Jesus to say, you know, I've done enough here. God be with you. Go. But he doesn't. He says, no, we're going to feed them. You're going to do it. You're going to feed them. And the disciples push back, right? They're like, are you serious? Slow your roll, Jesus. You want us to spend a fortune on feeding these people we didn't even invite? And Jesus says, yeah, I'm serious. Show me what you've got. And they bring out their little 5 dry loaves of crusty bread and their 2 little pieces of dried fish. And Jesus takes the bread. He says a prayer. He divides it. And at this point, the people have all been divided into little groups, little separate groups. See Francis if you'd like to join. And Jesus starts passing the bread around, and as so often happens when Jesus is present, what wasn't enough for 13 people suddenly becomes enough for 5,013 people. Not just enough, but a surplus. That's what the passage tells us, right? And maybe that happened. I don't want to discount miracles. But what I do know is that this passage is not an historical accounting of what happened that day. This passage is a parable. And I think it's a metaphor for choice and the power of choice, this divine gift we've been given to make an impact with the choices we make. You know, choice is like a stone. It sits in the palm of your hand, and you feel the weight of it, and you're like, I got to get rid of this at some point. And when you're ready to make that choice, you toss it out on this placid lake of the universe, right? And it hits the water, and it breaks the water, and it sends ripples everywhere. Stone sinks down to the bottom, but the ripples continue. And I think what this metaphor is telling us is when you choose with love, those ripples multiply, and there's always enough. Maybe there was always enough when Jesus was around, because he always chose with love. Now, after everyone's being fed, this passage tells us that Jesus and the disciples look out over everyone eating, and they look like a patchwork quilt of wildflowers sitting on the green grass. And I think that's another metaphor. I think it's telling us that choices are like seeds. And when you plant your seeds with love, you can grow a very beautiful, life-sustaining, bountiful garden. So choice is kind of impactful, right? You know, when my kids were teenagers, they would be going to spend the night at a friend's house or going to a party, and I'd tell them, have a good time, make good choices. And they'd roll their eyes and they'd leave. And sometimes they made good choices, and sometimes they didn't. That's still true, and they're men. But the point I was trying to make, and I hope that you are a slightly more receptive audience than 2 teenage boys, is that choice is a sacred gift. bestowed upon us by creation, who has made us the gatekeepers of those individual unique choices that we make. I'm sure you're all familiar with the very famous quote by Dr. Martin Luther King, who said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, right? And I think the lesson of Jesus' ministry, not just this passage, but his entire ministry, is the choices we make bring about the actions that become the force placed on that arc, bending it, no matter how slowly, clearly too slowly sometimes, towards justice. Now, if you're like me at this point in your spiritual journey, you're saying, well, that's all well and good, but I'm not Jesus, right? I feel angry. I feel frustrated sometimes. I feel irritated. I feel intolerant. I feel judgmental. And to that I say, take a number and stand in line. Me too. But feelings happen almost insidiously, right? They're sneaky little things. Feelings are standing next to you in the room before you've even heard them knock at the door. But when you act with kindness, when you act with tolerance, when you act with love, when you act with compassion, those are choices. Feelings are the things sloshing around inside of you in those brief seconds between stimulus and response. Choice is the magic creation has given us to bring change to this world. And just in our country alone, I can think of the power of choice multiple times. The Declaration of Independence, abolitionism, the Underground Railroad, the Civil Rights Movement, women's suffrage, the Marriage Equality Act. Change comes about through choices. Feelings have never changed anything. It's okay to be human. But God has given us the tools to allow us to choose with love. And it's a powerful tool. Jesus knew about the power of choice. Jesus lived the power of choice. And he taught us the examples of how we can make more mindful choices to bring about a positive impact in our world. You know, we are in difficult times. Everything feels fragile and vulnerable. It feels that way as a national sentiment. It feels that way as a global sentiment, to be sure, before we even get to the individual things we're struggling with and dealing with. In those inflection points in history and in our own journeys, choice is the tool that we can use to propel ourselves forward in the direction we want to go, the force to bend the arc. Bidden or unbidden, God is present in so many ways, but not least of all in the choices that we make. So my hope for you today, my prayer for you, is that you feel the fire of this divine gift that you carry in you, that we all carry in you. And you leave here today, and you go out into the world, and you have a great time. But that along the way, you make good choices. Amen. Thank you.